I should clarify something before I write this confession, before I commit these words to a datapad that will likely be incinerated or buried in some ISB archive where truth goes to die. My name is Senior Analyst Kevran Tallow, Imperial Security Bureau, Research and Historical Revision Division, and for the past 7 years I have been assigned to what my superiors call Project Sentinel, which is the Empire's comprehensive effort to catalogue, analyze, and ultimately erase every trace of the Jedi Order from galactic memory. Not just their temples or their teachings, but their individual stories, the narratives that might inspire resistance or nostalgia, or anything resembling hope in a galaxy that has been carefully taught to forget what came before. They assigned me specifically to one target, one file that kept growing despite our best efforts to close it, one ghost that refused to stay buried, even though every official record declared him dead at the Jedi Temple during the Purge. They assigned me to Obi-Wan Kenobi. I was 29 when I joined the ISB, recruited from the Imperial Intelligence Academy on Coruscant, where I had distinguished myself in historical analysis and pattern recognition, skills that translated well to the Bureau's methods of information control. I believed in the work then. I believed that the Jedi had been corrupt, that they had attempted to overthrow the legitimate government, that their destruction was necessary for galactic peace. I believed what everyone believed, because belief was easier than questioning, and questioning led to interrogation rooms where people went in walking and came out on repulsor gurneys covered with white sheets. I was good at my job. I was thorough. I cross-referenced sources, identified contradictions, flagged potential resistance sympathizers who spoke too fondly of the Old Republic. I helped draft the revised history texts that described the Jedi as religious extremists who had manipulated the Senate for centuries. I wrote obituaries for men and women whose actual deaths I could never quite verify, creating official closure for lives that might still be continuing somewhere in the Outer Rim. I did this work in a climate-controlled office 3 levels below the Imperial Palace, surrounded by databanks and holographic projectors, drinking caf that tasted like recycled machinery oil, believing I was building something better than what had come before. Kenobi's file arrived on my desk in a sealed container that required my biometric signature and a clearance code I had to memorize rather than record. The physical weight of it surprised me. Most Jedi files had been reduced to simple summaries by then, a few pages confirming death and eliminating their legacy, but Kenobi's dossier was enormous. Thousands of pages spanning 4 decades, cross-referenced with military records, Senate archives, planetary security reports, intercepted communications, and something else, something my supervisor mentioned only once before telling me never to reference it again in official documentation: sightings, unconfirmed encounters, rumors that kept surfacing from Tatooine, from Mapuzo, from half a dozen worlds where someone matching his description had been seen, always briefly, always disappearing before any verification could occur. The file wasn't closed because we couldn't close it. Kenobi was Schrodinger's Jedi, simultaneously dead in every official narrative and alive in enough unofficial reports that the ISB couldn't quite commit to either reality. My assignment was simple in theory: trace his entire path from his earliest days as a Padawan through the Clone Wars and into whatever came after. Identify every action he took, every decision he made, every person he influenced, and then construct the definitive counter-narrative that would allow the Empire to finally neutralize his symbolic power. If he was dead, I would prove it beyond question. If he was alive, I would chart his movements with enough precision that a retrieval team could be dispatched. Either way, Obi-Wan Kenobi would cease to be a problem. They gave me unlimited access to sealed archives, to classified military debriefings, to interrogation transcripts from captured separatists and former Republic officials. They gave me 7 years. What they didn't give me, what they couldn't have anticipated, was what happens to a mind when it spends that long inside another person's life, tracking their decisions across decades, learning to think like them, to predict their movements, to understand the philosophy that guided them through war after war after war. I started at the beginning, with his apprenticeship under Qui-Gon Jinn, because that relationship seemed to define everything that came after. The official records from that period were sparse, mostly mission reports filed with the Jedi Council and Senate Committee on Oversight, but I found supplementary material in unexpected places. personal journals from Republic officers who had served alongside them, shipping manifests from the freighters they traveled on, even a few holovids from news services that had covered their involvement in various diplomatic crises. What emerged was a portrait of a young man who had been trained in absolute obedience to the Jedi Code, who had memorized every precept and principle, who approached problems with a rigidity that sometimes clashed with his master's more intuitive methods. There was a report from Naboo, from the blockade crisis, where a Republic captain described watching Kenobi argue with Qui-Gon about the proper protocol for engaging with planetary governments during trade disputes, the younger Jedi citing council regulations while the older one simply smiled and did what he felt was right. That dynamic fascinated me because it suggested that Kenobi's famous pragmatism, his later reputation for flexibility and negotiation, wasn't inherent to his character but something he had to learn, something that required him to overcome his own instincts toward order and structure. Then came the incident on Naboo that changed everything. The lightsaber duel in the Theed power generator, where Qui-Gon Jinn died and Kenobi defeated a Sith Lord while still only a Padawan, an act that should have been impossible according to every combat analysis the Empire had conducted on Jedi fighting techniques. I found the after-action reports, read the testimony Kenobi gave to the Council, studied the security footage from the facility until I could replay the entire fight sequence in my mind without watching the holos. What struck me wasn't the skill he displayed, though that was impressive, but the moment right after Qui-Gon fell, the 2 or 3 seconds where Kenobi was trapped behind a ray shield watching his master die, unable to help, unable to do anything except witness. The footage was grainy, but I could see his face, see the exact instant where something broke inside him, and I realized that every decision he made for the rest of his life emerged from that moment, from the knowledge that hesitation had consequences, that failure to act meant losing the people you loved. The ISB psychological profile had labeled him a standard Jedi archetype, emotionally repressed, dogmatically committed to their failed philosophy. But that assessment was wrong, or at least incomplete. Kenobi wasn't repressed, he was controlled, deliberately and consciously controlled, because he understood what happened when emotion overwhelmed discipline. He had felt it on Naboo, he had touched that rage, used it to defeat Darth Maul, and then spent the next 20 years making sure it never controlled him again. That distinction mattered because it meant his adherence to the Jedi Code wasn't blind faith but active choice, a daily decision to prioritize principle over instinct. And you couldn't counter-narrative that kind of conviction with simple propaganda. You couldn't just call him a religious extremist when he was actually a man who had seen the alternative to his philosophy and consciously rejected it. I moved forward through his years as a Jedi Knight, the period where he took Anakin Skywalker as his Padawan, and this was where the files became complicated because Anakin was, of course, Lord Vader now, and any analysis of his past required navigating multiple layers of classified information and explicit prohibitions. I was permitted to read certain documents about the relationship between Kenobi and Skywalker, permitted to note that the former had been responsible for training the latter, but I was prohibited from drawing any conclusions about how that training might have failed, or what specific factors contributed to Skywalker's transformation into Vader. This created an analytical gap at the center of my investigation, a black hole around which everything else orbited but which I couldn't directly examine. Still, I learned what I could from peripheral sources. Mission reports from the Clone Wars where the two of them fought together, communications logs showing their banter and disagreements, testimony from clone troopers who had served under their command. What emerged was a portrait of two men who complemented each other perfectly in combat, but struggled to understand each other's fundamental natures, Kenobi approaching problems through patience and negotiation, while Skywalker preferred direct action and overwhelming force. There was a particular incident on Jabiim, early in the Clone Wars, where Kenobi had been trapped behind enemy lines and presumed dead for several weeks, while Skywalker led the Republic forces in increasingly reckless assaults trying to recover him. I found the tactical analyses from Republic Command, read the casualty reports, saw the exact moment where Skywalker's grief transformed into fury and started costing lives. When Kenobi finally escaped and returned to Republic lines, there was a brief personal exchange captured on a clone's helmet recorder, Skywalker saying something like, "I thought you were dead," and Kenobi responding, "It takes more than that to kill me, my friend. But the important part was what happened next. The moment where Skywalker grabbed him in an embrace that lasted just slightly too long, that revealed a depth of attachment that violated every principle of Jedi training. Kenobi gently extracted himself, said something about needing to report to the Council, and changed the subject. He had to have known, even then, that his students' emotional connections were dangerous, that the attachment forming between them contradicted the very teachings he was supposed to instill, but he did nothing, or nothing effective enough to prevent what came later. The Clone Wars period consumed months of my analysis because the volume of material was staggering, every battle catalogued and cross-referenced, every strategic decision documented in triplicate. Kenobi had become a general, leading the 212th Attack Battalion under the command of Clone Marshal Commander Cody, and his military record was exemplary by any objective standard. He had won victories on Christophsis and Ryloth and Umbara, had negotiated surrenders with separatist commanders when surrender saved lives, had earned the loyalty of his clone troopers through a combination of competence and genuine concern for their welfare. There were reports from Cody himself, written before Order 66, describing Kenobi as the ideal officer, someone who listened to his men's tactical input and never spent lives unnecessarily. I found medical records showing that Kenobi had personally carried wounded clones off battlefields, had donated his own blood for transfusions when supplies ran low, had attended memorial services for fallen soldiers, even though Jedi philosophy technically discouraged mourning. These details troubled me because they contradicted the Empire's official narrative about Jedi arrogance and detachment. Kenobi had cared, demonstrably and repeatedly, and that caring had made him effective in ways the ISB profile couldn't account for. But there was something else in those war records, something darker that I found buried in classified after-action reports and encrypted personal logs. The Clone Wars had changed him. The man who fought on Christophsis wasn't quite the same person who negotiated on Naboo. He had learned to accept casualties, to make impossible choices about who lived and who died, to function in a state of perpetual crisis where failure meant worlds burned and millions suffered. There was a particular incident on Ryloth where he had ordered an orbital bombardment on a separatist position, knowing that Republic prisoners were being held there, calculating that saving the planet required sacrificing those soldiers. And the decision had been tactically correct, but the personal log he filed afterward showed a man barely holding himself together, writing about how many times he could make that choice before he stopped being the person Qui-Gon had trained him to be. The war was eroding him, gradually but inevitably, and by the final year he was operating on instinct and duty, the philosophical principles that once guided him reduced to reflexes he enacted without the energy for deeper contemplation. Then came the end, Order 66, the moment that every Jedi file led toward inevitably. I had access to the operational records from that period, the execution reports filed by various clone battalions, the casualty confirmations that arrived at the Imperial Palace in a steady stream for weeks afterward. Kenobi's file was different. Commander Cody had reported firing on him on Utapau, confirmed that the blast had knocked him off his Varactyl mount into a sinkhole, assumed that the fall and subsequent search operations would confirm termination, but they hadn't found a body. They had searched for 3 days, deployed probe droids and scanning equipment, interrogated locals who might have witnessed his escape, and found nothing. Cody's final report labeled the termination probable but unconfirmed, and that ambiguity had haunted the ISB ever since because Kenobi was too important to remain uncertain about, too dangerous to hope was dead without absolute proof. I traced the reports filed in the days and weeks after Order 66, looking for any indication of where he might have gone, and I found a curious pattern. There were sightings on Tatooine, just a few, scattered reports from Imperial informants about a human male matching Kenobi's description, purchasing supplies in Mos Eisley or Anchorhead, always alone, always paying in credits that couldn't be traced. The reports were never quite specific enough to justify dispatching a full investigative team, always arriving weeks or months after the supposed sighting, but they persisted with enough regularity that I became convinced they were real. Someone was on Tatooine, someone who looked like Kenobi, someone who was being very careful not to draw attention but couldn't quite disappear entirely. Why there, though? Why that particular desert wasteland on the edge of civilized space? I cross-referenced every mission Kenobi had undertaken during the Clone Wars, looking for any previous connection to the planet, and found only one. It was Anakin Skywalker's homeworld, the place he had been born into slavery before Qui-Gon freed him and brought him to the Jedi Temple. That connection should have been obvious, should have appeared in every ISB analysis of possible Kenobi locations, but it didn't, because no one wanted to suggest that Lord Vader's past might be relevant to current security operations, and the prohibition on analyzing Vader's origins meant that the Tatooine connection remained invisible to everyone except me, the analyst who had spent years learning to think like Kenobi, to predict his decisions based on his demonstrated patterns of behavior. If he had survived Order 66, if he was alive and hiding somewhere, he would choose a location that had meaning, that connected to his deepest failure or responsibility. And if that failure was Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side, then Tatooine made perfect sense as a refuge because it was where Anakin had begun, and perhaps where something Anakin had left behind still remained. I drafted a report outlining this theory, suggesting that the ISB deploy surveillance assets to Tatooine, monitor supply purchases and travel patterns, identify the human male who kept appearing in informant reports. I submitted it through proper channels, waited for approval, and received instead a summons to my supervisor's office, where a man in a senior analyst's uniform told me very calmly that I was to cease all investigation of Tatooine immediately, that Lord Vader had personal oversight of security matters related to his homeworld, and that my unauthorized speculation about his past constituted a breach of protocol that would be overlooked this one time provided I never repeated it. The message was clear. I had touched something dangerous, something that connected to power structures I didn't understand, and I needed to step back before I learned why people disappeared from ISB headquarters in the middle of the night. I deleted the report, purged it from my personal files, and continued my analysis in other directions, but the prohibition gnawed at me because it confirmed my suspicion that Kenobi was alive, that he was on Tatooine, and that someone at the highest levels of Imperial Command knew this and had chosen to leave him there. Why? What possible reason could justify allowing a surviving Jedi Master to live unmolested when the entire purge had been designed to eliminate exactly that threat, unless he wasn't living unmolested, unless he was being watched? Unless his presence on Tatooine served some purpose I couldn't identify from my position 3 levels below the Imperial Palace, staring at files and reports and trying to reconstruct a coherent narrative from fragments and absences. I shifted my focus to the philosophical question at the heart of my assignment. Who was Obi-Wan Kenobi, really, beneath the military record and Jedi training? What defined him as an individual, rather than an archetype? I went back through the personal logs I had access to, the private communications and journal entries that the ISB had recovered from various sources, looking for the moments where his mask slipped, where the controlled exterior gave way to something more vulnerable and human. There weren't many. He was remarkably disciplined about keeping his inner thoughts private, even in supposedly confidential documentation. But there were glimpses. A letter he had written to Duchess Satine Kryze of Mandalore during the Clone Wars, never sent but recovered from his quarters at the Jedi Temple after the Purge, where he admitted that their brief romance years earlier still haunted him, that he sometimes wondered what his life would have been like if he had chosen her instead of the Jedi Order. A conversation with Anakin recorded by surveillance equipment on a separatist listening post, where Kenobi had admitted to being tired, to feeling the weight of too many deaths and too many failures, to doubting whether the Jedi were actually winning the war or just prolonging the suffering. A meditation log from the final weeks before Order 66, where he wrote about sensing something dark approaching, a disturbance in the Force that he couldn't identify but that filled him with dread every time he tried to meditate on the future. These fragments painted a picture of someone far more conflicted than the ISB profile suggested, someone who struggled with doubt and loneliness and the accumulated trauma of decades spent watching people die. The Jedi Code demanded detachment, but Kenobi had never quite achieved that, had never stopped caring about individuals, even when caring meant pain. His relationship with Anakin was the clearest example. He had loved his student like a brother, had invested everything in training him properly, and when Anakin fell to the dark side it had shattered something fundamental in Kenobi's understanding of himself. There was a surveillance recording from Mustafar, from the final confrontation between them, that I watched exactly once before deciding I never needed to see it again. The audio quality was poor, the heat from the lava flows distorting the recording equipment, but I could hear their voices, hear Kenobi screaming, "You were my brother, Anakin, I loved you," while Skywalker burned, and I understood in that moment why he had gone to Tatooine afterward, why he had chosen exile on the planet where Anakin began. It was penance. It was self-punishment. It was a man condemning himself to watch over what remained of the person he had failed to save. That recording wasn't supposed to exist. According to official records, no surveillance had been operational on Mustafar during that period, but someone had been there. Someone had captured that confrontation, and the fact that the recording existed in my files meant someone wanted me to know about it, wanted me to understand the emotional stakes of the relationship between Kenobi and Vader. I started noticing other anomalies in my materials, other pieces of information that shouldn't have been accessible to a mid-level ISB analyst. Transcripts of conversations between the Emperor and Vader where they discussed the Jedi survivors, strategic memos about the Inquisitorius and its mission to hunt down Force sensitives, even a partial schematic of what appeared to be a superweapon under construction, something called the Death Star, that would have the power to destroy entire planets. These documents arrived in my secure inbox without any indication of who had sent them or why, without any official authorization or clearance codes, and I realized that someone was feeding me information, using my investigation of Kenobi as a vehicle to expose me to classified material I was never meant to see. I should have reported it immediately. Protocol demanded that I notify my supervisor about any unauthorized information access, submit to a security review, allow the ISB to trace the source of the leak and neutralize whatever threat it represented. But I didn't, because the information was too valuable, because I was too close to completing my analysis of Kenobi's path through the decades, and because some part of me, some part I had tried to suppress through years of loyal service to the Empire, wanted to know what these documents revealed about the government I served. I kept reading. I kept following the trail of information wherever it led, and slowly, gradually, inevitably, I began to understand that the story I was constructing about Obi-Wan Kenobi was also a story about the Empire itself, about the choices that had created our present reality and the costs we pretended not to see. The philosophical core of Kenobi's character, the thing that defined every decision he made across 4 decades of war, was his absolute commitment to what he called the civilized way. The belief that problems should be solved through negotiation rather than violence, through understanding rather than domination, through patience rather than force. It was a philosophy that made him frustratingly inefficient by imperial standards, that led him to waste time talking to enemies when execution would have been simpler, but it was also a philosophy that had made him extraordinarily effective during the Clone Wars because it meant people trusted him. Planets opened diplomatic channels that would have remained closed to other Jedi, and surrender became possible when surrender saved lives. The Empire had rejected that philosophy entirely, had built itself on the principle that power alone determined legitimacy, that fear was more reliable than trust, that the only way to maintain order was through overwhelming military superiority and the willingness to use it. These were fundamentally incompatible worldviews, and my investigation of Kenobi had forced me to examine why the Empire's approach was superior, except I was finding it increasingly difficult to articulate that superiority when the evidence suggested that Kenobi's way had actually worked, at least until the Jedi were betrayed and destroyed by the very republic they served. I found a report from Grand Moff Tarkin, dated about 2 years after the Empire's formation, where he discussed the strategic value of destroying Alderaan as a demonstration of imperial power, arguing that the Death Star would only be effective as a deterrent if potential rebels understood the consequences of defiance. The memo was chilling in its casual acceptance of planetary genocide, its reduction of billions of lives to a tactical calculation, and I couldn't help thinking about how Kenobi would have responded to such a proposal, how his first instinct would have been to find some other solution, some way to achieve security without mass murder. The fact that his approach was now considered naive, that the Empire's leadership viewed compassion as weakness and negotiation as failure, said something about what we had become in the years since the Clone Wars ended. We hadn't just defeated the Jedi, we had rejected everything they represented, every principle they died defending. and replaced it with a system that sustained itself through terror and surveillance and the constant threat of annihilation. But there was a gap in my analysis, a period of several years after Order 66, where Kenobi's activities on Tatooine remained almost completely obscure. The informant reports were too sparse to construct a daily narrative, just occasional glimpses of someone purchasing supplies or traveling between settlements, never staying visible long enough for identification. What was he doing during those years? How did he spend his days in the desert, alone with his guilt and failure, watching over whatever he had come to protect? I had my suspicions about what he was guarding, suspicions that connected to Anakin Skywalker's origins and to Vader's strange prohibition on investigating Tatooine too thoroughly. But I couldn't confirm any of it without conducting exactly the kind of direct surveillance I had been explicitly ordered to avoid. So I did the only thing I could. I constructed a psychological profile based on everything I had learned about his character, his patterns, his philosophy, and I tried to imagine what form his exile would take. He would have established a routine, something simple and sustainable that didn't draw attention. Perhaps he lived on the edge of the Western Dune Sea, in one of the abandoned moisture farms that dotted the wastes, growing older and more weathered while the galaxy forgot he existed. He would have meditated, practiced his lightsaber forms even though he had no opponent to fight, maintained his connection to the Force even though the Jedi Order was gone and he was, for all practical purposes, the last of his kind. He would have watched, waited, prepared for some future moment when his skills would be needed again, when the exile would end and purpose would return. And he would have suffered, quietly and privately, because suffering was the cost of survival when everyone you loved was dead or corrupted, when your entire civilization had been erased, when the principles you dedicated your life to had been revealed as insufficient to prevent catastrophe. That was the Kenobi I constructed in my analysis. A man in purgatory, choosing to endure rather than escape, accepting punishment he believed he deserved, while holding himself ready for a redemption he might never receive. It was a portrait that made him almost tragic, almost sympathetic. And that was when I realized the danger I was in, the subtle corruption that had been spreading through my thinking during the 7 years I spent inside his life. I had started this investigation as a loyal ISB analyst committed to exposing and eliminating a threat to the Empire, but somewhere along the way, without quite noticing the transition, I had begun to admire him, to respect his choices even when I disagreed with them, to see him as a human being rather than a target. The anonymous information that kept appearing in my inbox had accelerated that transformation, exposing me to the Empire's darkest operations and forcing me to compare our methods to his philosophy. And now I found myself in a position where I could no longer write the counter-narrative my superiors expected, could no longer reduce Obi-Wan Kenobi to a propaganda caricature that would justify his destruction. I tried to fight it, tried to reassert the analytical distance that had once come so easily. But the attempt felt hollow because I had learned too much, seen too clearly the shape of both the man I was investigating and the government I served. There was a moment, late one night in my office 3 levels below the Imperial Palace, when I pulled up the Mustafar recording again, listened to that anguished declaration of love and loss, and realized I was crying. Actually crying. For the first time since I joined the ISB, I wiped my face, checked the surveillance feeds to make sure no one had witnessed my emotional breakdown, and understood that I had become exactly the kind of security risk I was trained to identify and eliminate. My investigation of Kenobi had exposed me to seditious ideas, had undermined my loyalty to the Empire, had transformed me into someone who questioned orders and doubted authority, and wondered whether the galaxy might be better served by negotiation than fear. The next morning, I found another document in my inbox, this one different from the previous anonymous deliveries. It was a message, brief and unsigned, providing coordinates to a location in the Coruscant underlevels and a time 3 days hence. No explanation, no context, just the implicit suggestion that I should attend this meeting if I wanted answers to the questions I had been asking. I knew it was a trap. Every procedural training I had received screamed that this was how ISB agents were compromised, lured to secret meetings where rebel sympathizers attempted recruitment or where rival bureaus set up loyalty tests to identify potential defectors. I should have reported it immediately, turned over the message and submitted to an investigation, accepted whatever consequences came from my compromised analysis. But I didn't, because after 7 years of living inside Obi-Wan Kenobi's decisions, I had learned something about the moment where you choose between safety and truth, between obedience and conscience, between the easy path and the right one. I had learned that some choices can't be avoided just because they're dangerous, that some moments demand you act according to your principles, even when principles lead to ruin. I went to the meeting, descending through level after level of Coruscant's industrial infrastructure until I reached the coordinates, a maintenance junction in the power distribution network, where the city's perpetual hum reduced to a dull vibration in the walls. Someone was waiting there, a figure in dark clothing with their face obscured, and when they spoke, I recognized the voice from testimony I had read during my investigation, from trial transcripts and interrogation records, and classified debriefings. It was Bail Organa, senator from Alderaan, secretly one of the founders of the Rebel Alliance, and he knew my name, knew what I had been investigating, knew everything about my 7-year descent into Kenobi's history. He told me that the information had been intentional, that he had arranged for those documents to reach me because he understood what prolonged exposure to Kenobi's story would do to someone who actually paid attention, someone who tried to understand rather than simply condemn. He told me about the network of former Jedi sympathizers still operating within the Imperial bureaucracy, about the slow work of preserving truth in an age of systematic lies, about the importance of witnesses who could testify to what the Empire really was beneath its propaganda. And then he told me something I had suspected but never confirmed. Obi-Wan Kenobi was alive, living in exile on Tatooine, watching over Luke Skywalker, Anakin's hidden son, protecting the boy until he was old enough to potentially challenge the Emperor and restore something like justice to the galaxy. The entire story I had been investigating was real, was ongoing, was part of a larger plan that stretched decades into the future, and my analysis had brought me close enough to the truth that I now represented either a tremendous asset or an unacceptable risk. Organa offered me a choice, the same choice Kenobi had faced on Naboo and Mustafar, and in 100 battles across the Clone Wars. I could report this meeting, return to the ISB, continue my loyal service to an empire that reduced people to statistics and planets to strategic targets. Or I could disappear, join the nascent rebellion, use my knowledge of Imperial intelligence operations to help protect the scattered survivors of the Jedi Purge and build resistance to a government that sustained itself through fear. It was a choice between safety and principle, between the known path and the uncertain one, between the person I had been when I started investigating Kenobi and the person I had become by understanding him. I thought about the 7 years I had spent tracing his path through decades of war, about the decisions he made and the prices he paid, about his commitment to what he called the civilized way, even when civilization collapsed around him. I thought about the Mustafar recording, about that declaration of love in the face of absolute loss, about choosing to save what remained rather than accepting annihilation. I thought about the files still waiting in my office, the comprehensive analysis of Obi-Wan Kenobi's life that I would never complete according to my original assignment, that I could never shape into the counter-narrative the Empire demanded. And I understood that my investigation had never really been about him at all, or not only about him. It had been about learning to see what the Empire actually was, about recognizing the difference between power and legitimacy, about understanding why someone might choose exile and suffering over collaboration with systematic evil. I told Organa I would need time to extract certain files from the ISB archives, information about Inquisitorious operations and Death Star construction and surveillance networks that could help the rebellion protect Force sensitives and plan strategic responses. I told him I would need 3 days to arrange my disappearance in a way that wouldn't immediately trigger a massive manhunt, to create plausible alternative explanations for my absence that would buy time before the Empire realized I had defected. And I told him that when I vanished, I wanted to go to Tatooine, to meet the man whose story had transformed my understanding of the galaxy, to see for myself whether the person I had constructed from files and reports and 7 years of obsessive analysis bore any resemblance to the actual Obi-Wan Kenobi still living in the desert. Organa agreed to everything, gave me a secure communication channel and instructions for the extraction, and then said something I didn't fully understand until much later. Kenobi won't be what you expect. The years have changed him, the isolation and guilt and waiting. The man you studied is still there, but diminished, worn down by survival. Don't expect the war hero or the Jedi Master. Expect someone who's learned to live with failure. It was a warning, an attempt to manage my expectations, but it didn't diminish my need to meet him, to complete the investigation not with a report but with an encounter, with the chance to ask the questions that files couldn't answer and surveillance couldn't capture. I spent the next 3 days meticulously copying classified information onto isolated data cores, selecting the intelligence that would be most valuable to a rebellion trying to survive against overwhelming Imperial power. I pulled Death Star schematics and supply chain analyses, lists of Inquisitors and their operational patterns, surveillance protocols for force-sensitive detection, strategic assessments of Imperial fleet deployments, everything I could access without triggering security alerts. I worked late into the nights, alone in my office 3 levels below the Imperial Palace, and I thought about how Kenobi must have felt in the hours after Order 66, after Mustafar, after everything he believed in collapsed, and he was left with nothing except the choice to keep going or surrender. The parallel wasn't exact, but it was close enough to give me courage, to remind me that transformation was possible even at the moment of greatest loss, that choosing a new path didn't erase who you had been, but added to it, complicated it, made you larger than the single story you had told yourself about your identity and purpose. On the final night, I erased my investigation of Kenobi from the ISB archives, purged every file and report and analysis I had created over 7 years, leaving only the original assignment documents and a fabricated conclusion stating that Obi-Wan Kenobi had died on Utapau during Order 66, that all subsequent sightings were misidentifications or hoaxes, that the file could finally be closed. It was a small act of rebellion, a way of protecting him from any future analyst who might duplicate my work, and it felt appropriate somehow, like returning a gift he had unknowingly given me. Then I took the data cores and walked out of Imperial Intelligence headquarters for the last time, descended through Coruscant's underlevels to a maintenance hangar where a nondescript freighter was waiting, and left behind everything I had built during my years of loyal service to an empire I finally understood well enough to betray. The journey to Tatooine took 4 days, traveling through hyperspace lanes that avoided Imperial checkpoints and sensor networks, and I spent the time reading through the files I had stolen, familiarizing myself with the intelligence I would need to deliver to Organa's contacts. But I also spent time thinking about the moment ahead, about what I would say to Kenobi when I finally met him, about whether he would even care that an ISB analyst had spent 7 years studying his life and had been transformed by the investigation. What do you say to someone who has become your accidental teacher, whose choices have guided you toward defection and treason, whose example has given you the courage to reject everything you once believed? Thank you seemed inadequate. I understand you felt presumptuous. I'm here because of you was true but insufficient. Maybe there were no words that could capture the relationship between a man and the person who studied him obsessively from a distance, who learned to think like him without ever speaking to him, who made life-altering decisions based on principles he demonstrated across decades of war and loss. We landed in Mos Eisley, the spaceport that appeared again and again in those fragmentary informant reports, and I disembarked with a datapad containing coordinates to Kenobi's supposed location, a homestead in the Western Dune Sea that surveillance assets had identified years ago but never investigated further due to Vader's prohibition. I hired a speeder, loaded supplies, and set off across the desert, watching the sun set and the temperature drop and the landscape transform into something alien and beautiful and hostile. The coordinates led me to a small dwelling built partially underground, its exterior weathered by sand and time, and I approached slowly, uncertain whether I should announce myself or simply wait for him to sense my presence through whatever means Jedi Masters used to perceive approaching visitors. I didn't have to wait long. He emerged from the dwelling before I reached it, a figure in worn desert robes, older than I expected, more weathered and tired, but unmistakably the face I had seen in thousands of files and holos and surveillance images. Obi-Wan Kenobi, alive, real, standing in front of me with an expression that suggested he knew exactly who I was and why I had come, that he had perhaps been expecting this visit, or one like it, that my arrival was simply another moment in a long sequence of moments that made up his exile. He invited me inside without questions, offered me water and a place to sit, and then waited for me to explain myself, his patience as evident in person as it had been in every diplomatic report I had ever read about him. So I told him everything. About my assignment, about the 7 years I spent investigating his life, about the anonymous documents that exposed me to the Empire's darkest operations, about Bail Organa, and the choice I made, and the intelligence I had stolen, and my need to meet the man whose story had changed everything I believed about loyalty and principle and service. I told him about reading his personal logs, about watching the Mustafar recording, about learning to think like him until I couldn't think like anything else, until the ISB analyst I had been dissolved, and someone new emerged, someone who couldn't write the counter-narrative the Empire demanded because the actual narrative was too powerful, too true, too important to distort. He listened to all of it without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when I finished he was quiet for a long time, looking out through the dwelling's small viewport at the desert beyond. Then he said, very quietly, "I'm sorry you saw that recording. I'm sorry that moment was preserved. Some things should be allowed to remain private, to die with the people who experienced them." It wasn't what I expected him to say. I thought he might ask about the intelligence I had stolen, might want to know about inquisitorious operations or imperial strategy, might be interested in how the rebellion could use my knowledge to protect Force sensitives or disrupt the Empire's plans. Instead, he was focused on that single moment of anguish on Mustafar, on the exposure of his deepest pain, on the violation of preserving what should have been forgotten. I apologized, told him I had only watched it once, that I understood it was a betrayal to include such footage in official files, but he waved away my contrition with a gesture that was both weary and resigned. "It doesn't matter now," he said. "The past is fixed. We can only influence what comes next." And then he asked me what I intended to do with the intelligence I had stolen, where I planned to go after Tatooine, whether I understood that defecting from the ISB meant spending the rest of my life hunted by the very apparatus I had served. I told him Organa had contacts who would extract me to the rebellion's hidden networks, that I would use my knowledge of Imperial intelligence operations to help protect survivors and resist the Empire's expansion, that I had accepted the consequences of my choice, just as he had accepted the consequences of his exile. He smiled at that, a small, sad smile that contained decades of similar choices and their costs, and said, "Then you understand what I've learned during these years in the desert. Principle has a price. Conviction requires sacrifice. The civilized way, as I used to call it, demands that we give up safety and certainty in exchange for staying true to what we believe is right. You've paid the down payment by coming here, by leaving the Empire. The rest of the cost will come later, in smaller moments you can't anticipate, in the daily work of staying committed when commitment would be easier to abandon." It was exactly the kind of thing I had imagined him saying based on 7 years of studying his philosophy, but hearing it directly, in his actual voice, with the weight of his lived experience behind it, made it real in a way files and reports never could. We talked for hours that night, about the Clone Wars and the Jedi Purge and the years of exile, about Anakin and Vader, and the difference between the two, about the rebellion, and whether it had any realistic chance of defeating an empire that controlled most of the known galaxy. He was more pessimistic than I expected, more doubtful about the possibility of victory, but also more committed to trying despite the odds, to keeping hope alive even when hope seemed irrational. "We don't fight because we expect to win," he told me. "We fight because the alternative is accepting oppression as inevitable. And I've seen what happens when good people accept evil as unchangeable. The galaxy becomes what we saw during the Clone Wars, everyone serving a system they know is corrupt because changing it seems impossible. Someone has to be willing to say no, to resist, to maintain the possibility that things could be different. That's what the rebellion is, ultimately. Not an army or a government in waiting, but a refusal to accept the Empire's vision of the future as the only option." I asked him about Luke, about the boy he was watching over, and his expression shifted into something more guarded, more protective, though he didn't deny the connection. "Some secrets need to be kept absolutely," he said, "not because truth isn't valuable, but because certain truths would destroy the people they're meant to protect. If Vader knew his son survived, if the Emperor understood that Anakin's bloodline continued, the child would become a weapon or a target or both, and everything we suffered through on Mustafar would have been for nothing. So I watch, and I wait, and I prepare for the day when he's old enough to choose his own path, when I can train him the way I should have trained his father, avoiding the mistakes that led to catastrophe. It was an admission of failure, an acknowledgement that his training of Anakin had been flawed, insufficient, part of what created Vader, and I heard in his voice the guilt he still carried, the weight of believing himself responsible for the galaxy's transformation into an authoritarian nightmare. I stayed at his dwelling for 3 days, learning from him not through formal instruction but through observation, through watching how he lived in exile, how he maintained his discipline and connection to the Force despite isolation, how he found meaning in small tasks and preparations for a future he might not survive to see. He practiced his lightsaber forms each morning, moving through the sequences with a precision that had been honed over decades, keeping skills sharp for conflicts that might never arrive. He meditated for hours, sitting motionless while the desert wind rattled the dwelling's walls, maintaining his connection to the Force even though the Jedi Order was gone and he was, in most practical senses, its last representative. He studied, reading from a datapad filled with texts he had preserved from the Jedi archives, keeping their teachings alive in his memory so that they might be passed on to Luke when the time came. And he endured, simply and quietly endured, the loneliness and guilt and waiting that defined his exile. On my final night there, before the extraction team arrived to take me to the rebellion's hidden bases, I asked him the question that had been at the center of my investigation from the beginning. Who was Obi-Wan Kenobi, really? Beneath the roles and titles and legends, what defined him as a person rather than an archetype? He thought about it for a long time, long enough that I started to think he wouldn't answer, and then he said something I've never forgotten, something that recontextualized everything I had learned during 7 years of studying his life. I'm someone who tried his best and failed in the most consequential ways possible, and who has to live with that failure while still maintaining hope that the next generation might succeed where I didn't. That's who I am. Not a hero or a legend or whatever the stories claimed, just a man who made choices and lived with consequences and refuses to give up, even though giving up would be easier. The extraction team arrived the next morning, a small ship piloted by rebellion operatives who treated Kenobi with obvious reverence, calling him Master and General, and various titles he gently deflected. I boarded with my stolen intelligence, with my data cores full of Imperial secrets, and I watched through the viewport as Tatooine receded and Kenobi's dwelling disappeared into the desert, and I understood that I would probably never see him again, that this 3-day encounter was all I would get after 7 years of living inside his story. It should have felt insufficient, anticlimactic, but it didn't, because I had learned what I needed to learn, had received the confirmation that the man I constructed from files and reports was real, was still fighting in his own way, was still committed to the principles that defined him, despite everything he had suffered. The intelligence I provided helped the rebellion protect dozens of Force-sensitive children from inquisitorious raids, helped them plan operations against Death Star supply chains, helped them understand Imperial surveillance protocols well enough to avoid detection during critical missions. I became a strategic analyst for the Alliance, using my training to counter the very techniques I had once employed in service of the Empire, and I never regretted the choice I made in that Coruscant underlevel when Bail Organa offered me a way out. But I also never forgot where that choice came from, never lost sight of the fact that my defection began the day they assigned me to investigate Obi-Wan Kenobi, to trace his definitive path through decades of war, to construct the counter-narrative that would neutralize his symbolic power. They had wanted me to destroy his legacy, to reduce him to propaganda, to prove that the Empire's philosophy was superior to his outdated commitment to negotiation and patience, and what he called the civilized way. Instead, I became his student, learning from his choices across 40 years of conflict, understanding that principle has costs, but that abandoning principle costs more, that power without legitimacy is just tyranny wearing a uniform, that the civilized way isn't naive or weak, but actually the hardest path to walk, because it requires maintaining your humanity when violence would be simpler. They assigned me to Obi-Wan Kenobi thinking I would expose his weaknesses, and I did. I documented every failure and doubt and moment of vulnerability, but I also discovered his strengths, the qualities that allowed him to survive catastrophic loss and maintain hope when hope seemed irrational. And in discovering them, I couldn't help but adopt them, couldn't help but ask myself what he would do in my position, couldn't help but choose defection over loyalty, when loyalty meant serving an empire built on fear and oppression and the systematic elimination of everything he died defending. This confession will probably never be read by anyone except myself, will probably be destroyed the next time I need to purge sensitive information before an Imperial raid, but I needed to write it anyway, needed to document how an ISB analyst spent 7 years investigating a Jedi Master and ended up joining the rebellion, needed to preserve the story of how learning someone's history deeply enough can transform your own. The Empire wanted the definitive path of Obi-Wan Kenobi through decades of war so they could use it against him, could erase his influence, could ensure he remained dead whether his body was found or not. Instead, they created a document that testified to why he mattered, why his choices were worth studying, why his philosophy represented something worth dying to preserve. They turned me into a witness, and witnesses are dangerous in authoritarian systems because witnesses remember, and memory is the enemy of propaganda. And the truth about Obi-Wan Kenobi is that he was everything the Empire claimed to be but wasn't. Principled, restrained, committed to protecting rather than dominating, willing to sacrifice himself for something larger than personal power. I don't know if he's still alive on Tatooine, still watching over Luke, still preparing for the confrontation that will eventually come when Vader discovers his son survived. I don't know if the rebellion will succeed in challenging the Empire, or if we'll all die in some forgotten battle that changes nothing. I don't know if the galaxy will ever remember the Jedi as they actually were rather than as the Empire describes them in revised histories and propaganda broadcasts. But I know that spending 7 years inside Obi-Wan Kenobi's story changed me in ways I can't undo and wouldn't want to, that learning to think like him taught me to think for myself, that his path through decades of war became my path out of complicity and into resistance. The Empire gave me an assignment, and I completed it, just not in the way they intended. I traced his definitive path, followed it through every choice and consequence, and when I reached the end, I discovered it had become my path too, leading me away from everything I thought I believed and towards something harder and better and more true. That's what studying history does when you actually pay attention, when you try to understand rather than judge, when you let yourself be changed by the stories you encounter. It makes you different, it makes you dangerous, it makes you free.